Yes, like on the 22nd of October, Turkey reached an historic agreement with Russia, which is being regarded by Turkey and much of the world as a diplomatic victory for the Turkish nation. This agreement could possibly change the outlook of Syria, in particular, northeastern Syria. Now, joining me to discuss this further is the Turkish Presidential Spokesperson and Senior Advisor to the Turkish President, Mr. Ibrahim Kalin. First of all, thank you very much for taking out the time for us. I know you had a very busy schedule, so thank you very much. Let me start by asking you, over the past 8 days, Turkey has signed 2 different agreements with 2 different nations, conducted an anti-terrorist operation in northeastern Syria. Now the question is, has Turkey achieved what it wanted to?
Yes, in fact, we did, I think, make major progress in terms of achieving our goals. The 2 deals within a span of 10 days since we began the Peace Spring operation on October 9th are extremely significant, not only for us, but also for Syria, for counterterrorism efforts, for the return of the refugees, for the political process in Syria, the Astana and the Geneva processes, the meeting of the Constitutional Committee, which will take place at the end of this month. Considering all these elements, they are 2 major achievements, one with the Americans, one with the Russians, 2 key players on the Syrian scene. Our president has identified 2 major goals for this Peace Spring operation. One was to clear our border from all the terrorists. The second one was to create conditions for the refugees to go back to. So we have achieved the first goal with the 2 agreements that we have signed with the Americans and the Russians by clearing this area. Of course, we are in the process of moving all the YPG terrorists from the Turkish-Syrian border, and we are in the process of verifying the withdrawal of these YPG terrorists from the Tel Abyad-Ras Ain area. But as of this morning, our Ministry of Defense has also announced that there is no need for any further military combat operation in this part of Syria. Therefore, the Peace Spring operation has come to an end officially, but of course our soldiers are there. They will now continue to secure the area, stabilize the area, help the refugees or the IDPs, the civilians and other people who perhaps had to either change places or flee because of the oppression and the threats coming from the YPG. But things seem to be quiet as we speak now. So overall, it's a major achievement for Turkey, but we still have a lot of work to do.
All right. Now, in the Memorandum of Understanding reached between Turkey and Russia yesterday, there were more than 8 different articles. The question is, just for the sake of clarification, did Turkey make any concessions?
No, we've been very clear about our objectives. We've been working with the Russian colleagues for a long time under the Astana process umbrella. As you know, we've had the last trilateral summit here in Turkey last month, with our president chairing the session with President Putin and President Rouhani of Iran, where we've said that we fully respect Syria's territorial integrity, we protect Syria's political unity, and we are against any kind of terrorist structures, networks on the Syrian soil, whether coming from PKK, YPG, or from ISIS, or Al-Qaeda, or any other terrorist elements. The political process can be completed only when this terrorist element or elements are removed from the Syrian scene. But we've had this special situation where along the Syrian-Turkish border, we've been subject to many attacks, infiltrations, shelling, and other types of violations from the YPG terrorists. The Americans, unfortunately, supported, armed, trained the YPG for the last 2-3 years in the name of fighting ISIS or Daesh. It was an ill-conceived policy from the very beginning, and I think now they're beginning to realize this at the government level as well as in general, in public. They see that there is no end to this policy, so they're looking for a way out. So our agreement with the Americans, in fact, complements what we achieved with the Russians, because the Russians also understand our concerns about this issue. They know that it's our red line. We have nothing against the Kurds in Syria, but we cannot let a terrorist corridor or terrorist state-like structure in Syria, just to the south of our border, or any part of Syria. Therefore, we have not conceded anything. To the contrary, our president achieved something really remarkable yesterday by spending almost 7 hours with President Putin, who understands our president's concerns, outlook, and who also appreciates Turkey's very straightforward position on all of these issues that make up the Syria, with the very complicated Syria file.
Okay. Now, a question about Turkey's cooperation with Russia. Although Turkey and Russia have both supported opposite sides in the Syrian conflict, we are witnessing more and more frequent visits by the Turkish president to Russia and agreements such as the Sochi agreement, which took place yesterday. Has Turkey found a new partner in Syria?
We've been working with Russia for a number of years now under the Astana process. You may remember that the first important outcome of the Astana process was the Idlib agreement, when everybody was very much concerned about what was happening in Idlib. And had it not been for our president's personal initiative and persistence throughout that process, we will have faced another major humanitarian crisis coming out of Idlib. You have about 2.5 million people squeezed in the Idlib area right now, and the regime wants to take over that place. It was our President Erdogan's initiative that really stopped the regime, and it was thanks to our cooperation with the Russians that we secured that area. We have 12 military posts there. We have our own soldiers on the ground, and thanks to their presence, we have a relatively calm situation in Idlib. Things could have been much worse had it not been for this success. Now, we have the second major outcome of the Astana process. This is maybe more bilateral between Turkey and Russia, but it's really benefiting also from the larger Astana format. Now, some people will say that, well, Turkey is moving away from the West, getting closer to Russia, not only on the Syria file, but on, say, defense, on the Black Sea, on other regional issues, on trade and bilateral relations, etc. Look, we don't see foreign policy as a zero-sum game. We believe that we have to have a 360-degree foreign policy outlook because the geography in which we find ourselves necessitates this kind of a global outlook. Our membership process to become a full member in the European Union, or the fact that we are a member of the Transatlantic Alliance, doesn't come at the expense of having good relations, say, with Middle Eastern countries, with African nations, or with Russia, China, or other parts of the world, and vice versa. The fact that we are opening up to Africa, to Asia, to Caucasia, having good relations with Russia, and improving our trade relations with, say, China or Southeastern nations, doesn't mean that we give up on our transatlantic alliance. I think in this age of growing interdependencies, this kind of very narrow foreign policy outlook where they try to box you in one alliance to the exclusion of others doesn't simply work. And if you look at how other nations of the world conduct their foreign policy, I mean, look at the United States, the UK, France, and other countries. They all have different engagements in different parts of the world. Again, with all due respect, they're after their own national interest. Turkey is doing the same. But nobody criticizes Western nations when they have major engagements in the Middle East, in Africa, or in Asia, or in Syria, Iraq, and other places. But when Turkey does it, then suddenly Turkey is criticized for moving away from the West or becoming more like, authoritarian Eastern nations, etc. These are really remnants of the past, from the Cold War period. I think we are way beyond the Cold War mentality. We live in a much more dynamic age where foreign policy has to have multidimensionality, a lot of subtlety, vigilance, and flexible approach to regional issues and alliances. We are a very strong member of NATO. We provide a lot of services to various NATO missions around the world, from Kosovo to Afghanistan and other places. It doesn't take away anything, from our engagements in other parts of the world. In fact, we wish the NATO could have been more effective, for example, in the security challenges that we face as a NATO member. When, for example, YPG terrorists or PKK attack Turkish soil, whether from Syria, from Iraq, or somewhere else, that's a NATO soil that is being attacked, not just Turkey's soil. We pay attention to NATO security when it comes to other countries. It's our right to expect our NATO allies to pay equal importance to our national security. Therefore, when we develop relations, say, with the Russians or with other countries around the world, it doesn't mean that we are giving up on other sets of alliances, relationships that we have. We are just simply expanding our foreign policy outlook. We want to have good relations with the Americans, with the Europeans. But if you look at how they have treated Turkey's existential national security issues, they have either dismissed them as insignificant or neglected them or simply turned a blind eye. What is Turkey supposed to do? As our president has always said, if our allies don't help us, then we will take care of our own. Americans are as much entitled, say, for example, to protect their U.S.-Mexican border against illegal immigration or drug cartels or others, as we are to protect our own borders. This is what we are doing. So if you find a partner, such as Russia, such as Iran, depending on the issues and other political developments, or an African nation, or a Middle Eastern nation, or say China or Japan, of course we will look for partnerships. We don't see this through narrow ideological windows. We try to expand and widen our foreign policy outlook. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Mr. Kalin, moving forward, when the Assad regime brokered an agreement with the YPG, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said, and I quote, "The regime entering Manbij is not very negative for me." Could you please provide some clarification, or in other words, what is Turkey's stance on the Assad regime at the moment?
First of all, it is still open to verification whether the Assad regime or Damascus has really reached an agreement with YPG. Based on what we heard from our Russian colleagues yesterday and what President Putin told our president in the negotiations yesterday, there is no such deal. I think they tried. YPG tried to have some kind of an arrangement where once the Americans leave, they will ask for protection or patronage of the Russians and the regime, but that didn't work out.
So you're saying there was no official deal between the YPG and the Assad regime?
No. In fact, as you can see, as the Russians signed to the agreement that we reached yesterday, in fact, YPG will be leaving the areas in which they are right now 30 kilometers to the south of our border. And the regime has agreed to this as well, according to what the Russians told us. Of course, we don't have direct contact with the Assad regime. So we very much doubt that there is any kind of deal. In the past, they tried to have this kind of a deal with the regime. It didn't work out because, according to some of the statements that we have seen, Damascus doesn't see YPG as a reliable partner. They see them as American mercenaries, even they use some harsh words as traitors, terrorists. They clearly have a separatist agenda. All of these things obviously go against the idea of a serious territorial integrity, social cohesion, ethnic harmony. All these things have been disrupted by YPG in the areas they have occupied. In regards to the Assad regime, our position hasn't changed. We don't believe Assad himself personally has the legitimacy, credibility to unite all Syrians after what happened over the last 7-8 years. But it's a political process, obviously. You're right. We don't support the Assad regime. We conduct our businesses through Russians and the Iranians. If you have to deal, with an issue that relates to Damascus, we do this through our partners in the Astana process. Now, there is a political process that we hope that will move forward. The Constitutional Committee will meet at the end of this month, which is another important achievement coming out of both the Astana and the Geneva processes. And according to that, a constitution, a new constitution will be written, or the current one will be revised substantially to include all Syrians. So the regime and the opposition groups are talking to each other. That's inevitable. You know, for any peace solution, of course, you have to have all sides at the table. It doesn't mean that you condone or legitimate, you know, all the sides, or you agree with their policies. But to find a solution, obviously, they have to sit together, and we support that process under the UN. Therefore, we will see how the political process will move forward. Our eventual expectation, and hopefully the outcome of all this process, will be that there will be a legitimate Syrian government with full transparency, based on democratic principles, elected by the people in free and fair elections. It will have accountability. It will be inclusive of all Syrians, Arab, Kurdish, Turkoman, Muslim, Christian, you know, all Syrians will be represented in this new structure. So we are going there step by step. It's been very painful and costly for the Syrian people, for the countries in the region, including us, in terms of security, human suffering, the migration crisis. Above all, of course, the destruction of such a beautiful country as Syria. I mean, you know, the destruction of such historic cities as Aleppo and parts of Damascus and Homs and other places. It's been a terrible ordeal, you know, for the Syrian people and for the people in the region. So our efforts are meant to end the suffering, end the violence and the killing, and pave the ground for a political solution that will be acceptable to all Syrians.
So Turkey is committed to a political solution in Syria. Now, moving forward, talking about the United States, the relationship between Turkey and the U.S. have seen many ups and downs recently. In a written statement yesterday, the U.S. confirmed YPG's retrieval from Operation Peace Springs area, something Turkey appreciated, I reckon. So Turkey was skeptical about the United States keeping its promises when it comes to Syria. Now that, at least it seems like, that the U.S. has delivered on its promise this time. Is your trust in the United States restored?
Since we began this process and the 120-hour deadline, you know, for the YPG to withdraw from Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad, we have followed the situation on the ground very closely, and we've been in close contact with our American colleagues. I've been in touch with Robert O'Brien, and our ministers have been in touch with their counterparts and our military and others. And as of yesterday, when the deadline was over, we were told by the Americans that all YPG terrorists have left this area. Now, as of this morning, in fact, we were still verifying this report, and our Ministry of Defense just a few hours ago issued a statement saying that there is no further need to continue the combat operation in the Peace Spring operation, but as I said, they will continue to monitor the area, normalize the situation, stabilize, and so on and so forth. So that mission will continue. You know, I wish we've had a different course of action with the Americans on this issue. I wish we had a way to implement the Manbij roadmap that we agreed to about a year and a half ago. I wish we had made more progress in terms of the U.S. disengaging from YPG, a terrorist element in Syria.
Let me put one question here, since you have mentioned the U.S. not keeping its promises regarding Manbij. Had the U.S. kept its promises, do you feel it would have been the U.S. partnering with Turkey in conducting joint patrols in northeastern Syria?
Well, we had joint patrols, but they were not enough. They were not. They didn't have the depth and the width to meet our expectations.
So has the Sochi agreement replaced the United States with Russia?
They are different agreements. The Sochi agreement that we signed with the Russians yesterday includes areas outside the area for which we have the agreement with the Americans. So we have two agreements, and we believe that they complement each other. So I think for us, it's a major gain, you know, because our president showed the map at the UN General Assembly in his speech there, saying that this area from the Euphrates River to the Iraqi border, more or less, about 444-kilometer area and about 30-kilometer deep, can be a safe zone for the Syrian refugees to go back to. Now, piece by piece, we are achieving this goal. And within such a short period of time as just a month, to be able to do that. That's really a major achievement, because our president gave that speech exactly a month ago. The UN General Assembly, it was September 24th or 25th. So that's really a major achievement. If you ask anybody a month ago whether this will be a reality, within a month, people will have said, no way, Syrian file is too complicated, the Americans will do something, the Russians will do something else, you will never reach that goal. But now, step by step, thanks to our president's really able leadership, his patience, his prudence, now we have reached this point. Therefore, they are two separate agreements. But we still have the problem of the U.S. supporting PYD, YPG even under the 30-kilometer area. It's in their interest also to stop funding, arming, training, and supporting YPG. Because if you are talking about serious territorial integrity, YPG agenda is clearly against it. They have the separatist agenda. If they are really genuinely interested in fighting against terrorism, as their president said, if the fight against ISIS or Daesh is over, then why are they still arming PYD, YPG? It's clear that they are not reliable partners, and the idea that you will call them allies by some American policymakers and others in the U.S. is just unbelievable to hear this, comparing or trying to level Turkey as a NATO ally together with PYD, YPG. That's just, it's mind-boggling. When you have a country like Turkey, a NATO ally, a reliable partner, versus a terrorist network. It's just unbelievable. I've said this before, and I want to repeat it again, as one of the ironies of recent political history, that the United States is arming and supporting a Marxist-Leninist separatist organization in Syria. I don't know how much the American public and the taxpayers know about this, but how much, regardless of how much they try to portray PYD, YPG as this, peace-loving democratic force against the ISIS barbarians and all of that, you have to see the bigger picture here. And that bigger picture, YPG is just another mercenary force. And it's clear that the moment Americans said that they are leaving from the northeast of Syria, they immediately went to Damascus, went to the Russians, looking for another boss. It's clear that they're not reliable. They're just after their own interest. Therefore, that issue still remains. I think it will be in the long-term interest of the United States to stop funding, training, arming YPG, work with the legitimate actors in Syria who will be at the table when it comes to the political solution. Not PYD, YPG. We will not accept them. The Russians will not accept them to be there. I believe the regime even will not accept them to be there as long as they are just the mercenaries of another power in Syria.
Okay, now my last question to you. A key meeting is coming up in November between the Turkish president and the US president. Which topics will dominate the agenda? Are you going to talk about the F-35 program?
Of course, there will be issues, but bilateral issues, no doubt. Trade, security, cooperation, economic relations, and other issues. There will be regional issues at the table. Our president will be going to Washington at the invitation of President Trump. After this agreement and securing the area now, we hope that it will be a positive agenda, even though we know the U.S. government is a lot of under pressure from the Congress, from the public, and others to put sanctions on Turkey and things like that. But our president has made it clear that it's not the right way or the proper way to use language of threats and sanctions against Turkey. It never worked, and it will never work. No amount of sanctions or threats will deter us from our fight against terrorism, and they know this. And we've been through this from the Gallipoli War to the War of Independence to Cyprus to the fight against PKK and many other trials that we've gone through in our modern history. We will not give up on our independence and sovereignty. But we want to work with our allies, obviously, and we want them to understand our security concerns and address them in a genuine, constructive manner. I believe President Trump has all the good intentions and ideas to improve relations with Turkey. I think he's displayed it on many occasions. He wants to resolve issues between us. He doesn't want to impose sanctions on Turkey. And he values Turkey, its leader, and Turkey as a nation. How much of this sentiment is reflected in the system, in the U.S. system, in the security bureaucracy, in the military bureaucracy, in the intelligence community, and in general among the lawmakers and others, that's obviously up to the American domestic political actors to comment on. But the U.S. cannot afford to lose Turkey. Turkey is a key partner, not only in NATO, but also in the region. And we will be going to D.C. on November the 13th with a positive agenda. We want to reach this $100 billion trade goal. We want to resolve the issues of counterterrorism, differences of opinion about this YPG issue. We want the U.S. to take steps against the Gülenists or FETÖ in the U.S., who have been using the U.S. system against Turkey to undermine U.S.-Turkish relations, who have been collecting hundreds of millions of dollars from American taxpayers' money, who have been engaged in all kinds of money laundering, visa fraud, and other illegal activities for which the FBI has launched a number of investigations. And they are responsible for the bloody coup attempt in Turkey, July 15, 2016. All the evidence is out there. We presented them to the Americans. So we hope that, especially on those two key issues, the Gülenists, the FETÖ in the U.S., and the U.S. support for YPG will come to an end. They will address them in a manner that befits the relationship, the strategic alliance that we have. And then I think we can move forward with a very positive agenda and realize our true potential, which is way beyond what we have at the moment.
All right. Mr. Ibrahim Kalin, Turkish Presidential Spokesperson, thank you very much for talking to us on ANews.
My pleasure.
So, you heard the Turkish Presidential Spokesperson. If you want to watch the interview again, you can visit our website or our social media accounts. I'm Jafar Hasnan, signing off from Ankara.